Hey guys, we're going to jump into day two of It Is Finished, our devotion on the last week of Jesus' life here on earth. And as we are looking at today's devotion, we really want to frame it in the context of where Jesus is and um, what's going on during this time. So, as we're looking at scripture, as we're looking at the story of what is happening, roughly a week before the Passover, Jesus arrived in a city called Bethany, which is about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. It's like a suburb of Jerusalem. And most of the days, he would come and go from Bethany to Jerusalem, and he would be staying at the home of Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. And at a dinner on either Friday night or Saturday night was when Mary anointed Jesus' feet with the expensive perfume. You probably heard that story before, but if not, we're really going to dig into that today and talk about talk about Mary's sacrifice, and that's really going to be the theme. So, again, the text of this devotion will be posted as well, but also I want us to just talk through it and read through it together. So, as Jesus was spending his last week in and around the city of Jerusalem, we got to remember why he was there. Why did he go to Jerusalem, and why would he be in that area? And it's because of the Passover. Every year, Jews would come from hundreds of miles to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And this was a commandment that God had given them. So let's remind ourselves, what is the Passover? So back in the Old Testament, when in Moses' time, when the Jews were held captive in Egypt, the Israelites were suffering terribly under the Egyptian ruler, the Pharaoh, and God's people cried out to them, and God raised up Moses to be their leader. And he went to Pharaoh and he demanded that the Pharaoh let the Israelites go, let them go and return to their homeland. But Pharaoh wouldn't listen. He didn't want to have any part of this, so God had to get his attention. And Pharaoh must have been a really, really bad listener, or just really numb to what was going on around him. Because remember the stories of those 10 plagues? You had bloody rivers, you had frogs, you had locusts, but none of that got his attention. And after so many warnings, God decided to send one of his angels to kill the firstborn of every person in Egypt, the firstborn child of every person in Egypt. But before he did this, he sent word to his people, to the Israelites, to sacrifice a lamb to God, take the blood of the sacrifice, and wipe their doorposts with it. And when the angel would come, he would see the blood and he would pass over their home and spare the lives of the Jews' firstborn children. And Pharaoh, he had had so many chances to prevent this, but he wouldn't listen to Moses. So God allowed this to happen. And the firstborn child in every Egyptian home, even Pharaoh's, was killed. So then that finally got his attention, and he decided he's going to let the Israelites go. So once a year, they would gather together to remember God's faithfulness. And this is the backdrop of why Jesus is in Jerusalem during this time. Jesus finds himself there with countless other Jews preparing for a week of celebration. But here's the thing we've got to realize, guys. Jesus knew things that the disciples didn't. He knew that this would be the last Passover that he would ever celebrate with them. And where we pick up, here Jesus is staying with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And this family absolutely loved Jesus with good reason. Jesus had raised his friend Lazarus from the dead, and he had also invested in the lives of Mary and Martha, and they were very close. They were all like family together. So it's probably Saturday night, less than a week before Jesus would be arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. And Martha was bringing in food to the disciples, and there are probably others there too. Lazarus is there, and they're sitting on the ground. At that time, you would sit on pillows and rugs with your feet behind you away from the food, and you kind of reclined while you were eating. So I kind of picture them all seated around, and then in comes Mary. But Mary doesn't have a plate of food. She's carrying a really big bottle. And as Mary approached Jesus, she bent over and she opened that bottle up and she poured this expensive perfume on his feet. Now, she didn't get a towel and wipe it off. The Bible tells us that she bent down and she started using her own hair, cleaning Jesus' feet, using that expensive perfume and her own hair there while they're sitting around the table having dinner. You know, this was really unusual. This raised a lot of questions. And then, especially, you hear Judas's response. And we remember Judas is the one who would betray Jesus. He was complaining that that was such a waste because this perfume was so expensive. But Jesus, he didn't complain. He was so moved by the sacrifice that Mary made, and recognized this as such a humble and a moving act of worship. Jesus looked at Mary and he saw what she had done. And he said to Judas, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial." No one at the table knew then what Jesus meant, but whether Mary knew it or not, that moment at the dinner table would be repeated not even a week later, when the body of Jesus would be taken down from the cross and prepared for burial. On this night, as they're gathered around that table, I want us to think about Mary's sacrifice. And I want to remind you that these verses are where you can read about this in Scripture are from John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. So what did Mary sacrifice? Well, first of all, she sacrificed that very expensive perfume. The Bible tells us that it was worth what a day laborer could have earned in an entire year. So this huge bottle of perfume was a year's worth of wages. And what was Mary even doing with that expensive perfume? We really don't know. It could have been her family's savings. It might have been just something that they had set aside in case times got tough. Some scholars think it might have been a dowry, a gift that a woman would bring to the table when she was getting married. And if this was Mary's dowry, she essentially sacrificed any chance she would have to get married by pouring out this perfume on Jesus' feet. It was a huge sacrifice, and Mary recognized what an important person Jesus was and how important he was to her, and thinking about the sacrifice that he would make for her later. Now, Mary also, she touched Jesus' feet. Now, in the time that we're talking about here, that would have been a job reserved only for a servant. And John included this here so that we can see what a sacrifice that was. That would have been so degrading, so beneath Mary. But she humbled herself to honor Jesus in this way. And, you know, this really caused a lot of confusion. The sacrifice caused a lot of confusion. And you really see it in the greed that flared up in Judas. And John includes the story in the gospel because he wants it to foreshadow Jesus' death. And in the Gospel of John, this is really the point that we can start reading the beginning of the story from the time Jesus begins his journey of his last week on earth up to the crucifixion. So as we close up, I want you to just remember how great Mary's sacrifice was, how much she loved him. And this should be a reminder to us all that we need to ask ourselves, how much do we love Jesus and how much are we willing to sacrifice for him?